Hi, everyone. Welcome to Keeping Track, Systems and Habits to Stay Organized. We are so glad you'll be joining us today, and I'm going to turn it over to Era to start us off with some welcoming words.
Yes, thank you, Elaine. My name is Era Beal. I'm she, her, hers, and I am the executive director at Tailspinner Children's Theater in Cleveland. And we are thrilled with support from Neighbor Up Cleveland to be presenting this series of workshops for artists to sort of help them grow in their financial know-how and system and habits, as it says on the slide. I think the one thing, and Elaine might touch on this too, that the pandemic has really clarified that having good records can really cut down on your headache and heartache when you have opportunities to arise for funding. And so I think this provides a great resource for those artists and who are maybe not necessarily as financially savvy or as financially comfortable as some other folks are. So thanks, Elaine and Minerva Financial Arts for putting this together. And we're happy you are all here.
Thanks so much. Yes. Well, with that, let's dive in. As Zara said, my name's Elaine. I use she, her pronouns, and I am joining you from Dublin, Ohio, which is just a little bit north of Columbus, and it's Kakashkia and Hopewell Indigenous and Cultural Lands. I'll share a visual description in case you're listening instead of watching. I am a 40-ish-year-old white woman with wavy blondish brownish hair, and I am wearing a navy blue jacket today with some white polka dots on it. I am a CPA and a personal financial specialist and an accredited financial counselor. So I like to say that when I'm working with individuals or organizations, we can talk about taxes and investments and budgeting and pricing and cash flow and strategies and all that good stuff. And I can also hand you tissues while we cry about those things, because money is never really only about the money. So I enjoy sort of getting deeper into kind of the human aspects of money, especially in the arts. I am the luckiest money professional ever because I have the great privilege of working with creative organizations and funders all across the country to help creative individuals with the business side and financial side of their creativity. I work with visual artists, literary artists, and performing artists, and it is so incredible to be able to be doing this work. As we go in, I want to make sure to touch on a couple of ground rules. As part of this conversation, we want to make sure there is space for your questions to be addressed. Those that were submitted in advance, we'll make sure to cover as part of this information, but also there is a chat feature that you are welcome to use if you have additional questions you'd like to put forward. And of course, we are all equal parts teachers and learners in this space, which means I might say something that really resonates with you and it might make perfect sense for your creative practice, or I might not. So feel free to take the information and apply it in a way that really works for you and reflects what strategies will be best for you, because these have to work for you in your creative practice. It doesn't matter if they work for me or not. You're the one that needs to figure out how this works for you. And then lastly, we want to make sure that stories that are shared stay within the space, but by all means, carry the lessons from those stories with you back to your studios and creative work. So what are we doing? Well, we're talking about record keeping, but more specifically, we wanted to identify the records to retain for tax purposes, plus some effective strategies for tracking specifically your expenses and income, although we'll touch on tracking some other things as well. We want to list the IRS criteria for record keeping, and then talk a little bit about the pros and cons of various systems and how you might think about evaluating different systems you may have access to. As Era mentioned, this is part of an overall webinar series. Previously, last month, we talked about taxes. So if you missed that or want to go back and listen to the recording, you have full access to it. Today, we're talking about systems and habits. And our final conversation on May 6th will be about post-COVID arts funding and opportunities and what that looks like for creative individuals. Of course, everything we talk about in this forum is for educational purposes only and is not intended to be used as tax, legal, or accounting advice. But with that, let's start with what systems you need. I always answer this question through the lens of money because that is the professional lens I apply to most things. And when I'm thinking about money, I'm thinking about income and expenses. So money coming in for your business and money going out, but also in terms of assets you may have. So this could be inventory, this could be merchandise, this could be equipment. We want to make sure we're capturing the information related to those assets, and then also any debt you might have. Era mentioned some of the relief programs from last year. The PPP program or the EIDL program are both examples of debt-based programs. So you may have taken on a loan, especially as part of the pandemic. And if it's been forgiven, that debt has gone away. But if it has not been forgiven, or maybe wasn't designed to be, it's important that you have an understanding from a financial perspective and in your system of what that debt is costing you in terms of interest, but also what the total balance is so it can go down over time. And when we're thinking about our customers, it's interesting as well to think about how we're tracking them, right? Because customers or clients or collectors tend to be individuals that give us money in exchange for our time or our work. So it's interesting to think about how you would track information on your customers. You can certainly do it through a financial system, right? If you are sending an invoice to a customer or a client, right, you will probably have all of their contact information, ways to get in touch with them. You may even link to their social media handles in your financial system, and that's great. But you might need something more robust as well to communicate with your customers. So you might think about a system like MailChimp or Constant Contact that would enable you to send out communications to your customers en masse, and that's okay. And then it's also interesting to think about how these two systems can talk to each other. So for example, if you are using, say, MailChimp and QuickBooks, there is a way to enable those systems to talk to each other so that anyone who signs up for your MailChimp account can then have that data automatically added to your QuickBooks account. Now, you usually have to do some cleanup of it. And if it doesn't work seamlessly, maybe because you're on a free version of either platform, then you can download the data and then upload it into the other system. So you can kind of manually make them talk to each other. But it's interesting to think about how your different needs may interact within the world of systems you choose. Also, when it comes to income, you may be selling your work or selling merchandise. If that's the case, you probably want some sort of system to track your work. An inventory tracking system can be a great example of this. And some of the financial systems do have opportunities for this. Although, if your work is very individualized and specific, the existing inventory systems within kind of a typical financial system may not work for you. So you may find yourself either building your own or purchasing your own inventory tracking system to make sure, in the case of a visual artist, for example, you are capturing materials and size of the piece and the year created and the name of the piece, and also probably an image of the piece. If you're selling items that are produced in a larger volume, perhaps prints or maybe CDs or albums, right? Some of the inventory systems within a financial system might work really well for that. So that might be all you need. But keep in mind that you probably want to track some of your creative work in some sort of organized way, and thinking about whether the existing platforms will do that for you is an important question to ask. You also might have other assets you need to track. Maybe you're a photographer and you want to make sure you're keeping information about your camera or various lenses you might have. That's a great thing to have stored in some sort of organized place, especially if you ever find yourself needing to make an insurance claim. You will need the model number, you might need the date of purchase or the receipt of the original piece of equipment, right? So if you have this information in some sort of organized place, it can be easier if you need it. I hope you never need it, but it's always better to have just in case. You may also earn income from different sources, right? In addition to selling work or working with clients or customers, you might find yourself applying for different grants or applying for shows or applying for different projects. And if that's the case, you probably want a place to track those applications as well, especially if they are grants that come up on a regular basis, or if they're grants that maybe you need to apply for once or twice before you successfully receive them, right? So thinking about, is it necessary for you to track other sources of income or the data behind other sources of income that might fall outside kind of a normal financial tracking system. And that's an important thing to think about. This might look like a sheet of paper that you update annually, or it could be some sort of database system, or it could be your calendar. But if this is something that comes up in your practice, you probably want to think about what a system for this looks like. And then, of course, that naturally leads us to some other individuals that kind of surround us. Sometimes these are funders, sometimes these are hosts of different events or managers of different programs that we might engage with. And yeah, sometimes they kind of feel like customers, but they're also broader than that, which sort of nudges us back to some sort of system for tracking humans that we're engaging with and communicating with regularly. So what does it look like if you are also adding partners or supporters to your customer tracking system, whether that is MailChimp or Constant Contact or something more robust like a Salesforce or something like that, right? All of a sudden, then we can see there are opportunities to segment the different audiences within these database systems so that we can send more tailored communications to the various groups we may need to keep updated on what we're doing on a regular basis. What this ultimately comes down to, though, is that it probably makes sense for you to spend some time thinking about what you're most curious about tracking. I would say you pretty much have to track your income and expenses. That's a no-brainer. But there are these additional layers that might be a way for you to add a layer of professionalism to your practice and make your life a little bit easier. But if we're thinking specifically about financial tracking systems, you have probably finished your taxes for 2020, or you're getting closer to finish them. And this is a good time to notice kind of what pain points you had during that process. I don't mean the process of paying taxes, right? There might be sort of a base level of pain that you have just accepted as part of the tax process. But I mean, was it really difficult to go back and track your mileage because maybe you didn't have really great records of all the various meetings you went to last year, or where you drove your personal car for business purposes? Or maybe you struggled to remember how you categorized different expenses in previous years, right? Those sort of frustrations could indicate an opportunity to maybe improve your system a little bit so that next year at this time, you don't have those same pain points. So since taxes might be fresh on your mind, it's a good time to think about what some of those may have been, right? That way you can tweak your system now and use it for the rest of the year so that next year's tax season is a little bit more painless. So what system should you use? You get to pick. And I know this is kind of an annoying answer, but you absolutely need to find a system that works for you. There are so many different options available with different features and different integration tools and different price points. But what works for someone else may not work for you. And what works for someone who wrote an article reviewing different systems may not work for you. And a system that I find relatively easy to use may not be that way for you. So give yourself permission to try out a couple of different systems and really dig into what you're looking for so that opening up this system won't be an awful exercise for you, but it'll be something that actually helps your process instead of serving as a source of frustration. And I think it's also worth thinking about why we're bothering with these systems, right? There are some what I would call defensive reasons for keeping records, meaning we're doing this to protect against something, right? The defensive reasons are in part that the IRS says you have to, the fact that you might get audited, especially if you received any of the emergency assistance last year. There's probably a likelihood that there will be audits, especially of those federal dollars and how they were expended. So having a system or some sort of organization in place to answer those questions more easily might help you sleep better at night. And you might have to prove your business expenses for a grant, for example, or for a lender, or for anyone else engaged with your business that might ask. So that's sometimes where we start in thinking about why we have to do this, right? And if that's your entry point, that is perfectly fine. But I would argue there are some more maybe empowered or proactive reasons to keep this information as well. If you have some sort of organizational system, especially one that gives you the data you need quickly, that can help you be fully aware of kind of the cash flow, the ins and outs of your business. And it can help you to be more intentional and mindful about spending opportunities, but also income opportunities. Because you may find yourself, if you're regularly paying attention to some of these things, you may find yourself noticing that some projects pay really well and you really enjoy doing them. So there could be an opportunity there to lean into more of those projects. So what would a marketing strategy look like that leads to more of those projects and fewer of the projects that you really find draining or are not as lucrative or profitable as they may have seemed at first? And you can use all of your financial information to inform that reflection and then use it to grow your practice going forward. And of course, we can use this information to reach our goals. And these certainly could be financial goals. I would like to earn $5,000 a month from my creative practice, but they could also be a little bit more holistic in nature. I was having a conversation yesterday with a writer who is telling really compelling stories in a really powerful way. And part of what she's thinking about is, what should she aim to make from her writing each month? But a more interesting, perhaps parallel question is, who is she aiming to reach with her writing each month, right? And those two things are related because reaching certain groups in theory leads to income, or maybe starts with income from a grant and then enables reaching certain groups. But it's interesting to think about using financial information as a way to express achieving creative or marketing or community goals. And of course, related to this, we know the old business adage that we have a tendency to manage what we measure. So if you are regularly looking at income from particular sources or expenses or engagement numbers, we have a tendency to manage what we are already paying attention to, which gives us an opportunity to be very intentional about what we pay attention to so that it can align with what we want to manage. So what information do you have to keep? If we're thinking about some of those defensive reasons for keeping records, the IRS tells us we must keep 4 key pieces of information for every transaction. The first is the date of the transaction. Then we need to know the counterparty. So who did you pay or who paid you? In the case of an expense, you would have paid someone else or a company. In the case of income, they would have paid you. What was the amount of the transaction? And lastly, what was the business purpose of the transaction? If you'll notice, date, counterparty, and amount all exist on your credit card statement or on a receipt or in your bank account ledger, right? That information is pretty easy to get. But it's that business purpose that you must proactively supply at a moment that is contemporaneous to the transaction, which means around the same time as the transaction, right? So that means if you are going to the store and purchasing something, your receipt will show the date, the counterparty, and the amount of that purchase, but it's incumbent upon you to record why that purchase is related to your business. If you think back to the tax webinar, we talked about how deductible business expenses are ordinary and necessary and effectively connected to your trade or business. Documenting this business purpose is that effectively connected piece. And to track that information, the IRS says you can use any system suited to your needs that shows your income and expenses. which means a shoebox counts, a big plastic envelope with receipts in it counts, emails with transactions and receipts counts, right? Those all count as systems that do show your income and expenses. But I would argue if we're leaning into some of those more proactive reasons of keeping records, there are more impactful ways of using a system to show more than just income and expenses, but actually provide information that you can use to make your business work for you better. I will also refer you to the IRS publication number 583. It's called Starting a Business and Keeping Records, and it has some great information in there about what information you need to keep. But if we know you need to keep the date, the counterparty, the amount, and the business purpose, what does that mean in terms of a system? Well, probably the easiest thing to do is to use your existing bank's system. You probably have a bank account, maybe a separate one for your business, or maybe just a personal bank account that you use for both business and personal purposes. And there's a really good chance that your bank at some point has invested in tracking software or budgeting tools or goal setting tools. And you can poke around and see if those tools will actually meet your needs. Almost always, the data will be already collected by the financial institution, and there will be some sort of place where you can either categorize expenses or add a note to the expense or the income item, so that then that's where you can add the business purpose. And so if you love your financial institution, you're comfortable using their app, you like how their website is laid out, using your existing banking system could be a really easy way to simply track your income and expenses and the business purpose in something you are already using. This is an example of a small regional bank's website from West Virginia. The bank is BB&T, and they've spent some time and resources investing in their tracking system, right? So you can see charts and graphs, you can make proactive budgeting plans, you can set goals, right? And all of this is connected to your existing bank account, which means it's pulling the information for you. So in some ways, that saves you time and energy. And I have yet to find a financial institution that charges for this, right? This is part of them providing financial services to you as an account holder. So whether you are with a credit union or a regional bank or a large multinational bank, there is probably access you have to some tools that they have built, and you may find those tools work perfectly fine for you. So the action item I would suggest is poke around on your bank's website or in their app and see what they've got and see if it works for you. And if it does, that's probably enough. I will say that database or your bank system probably will not talk to another system like a communications tool or something you're using to communicate with customers and clients. So you might find you're lacking some integration there, but that might not be something that's really crucial to you. So poke around and start with your bank's website and see if it works. If it doesn't work, or if you want to explore some other options, kind of the next level of system is a database system. So this would be something like Excel or Google Sheets or Numbers if you are a Mac user. All these programs basically work the same way, and they have very, very similar functionalities. Although if you're going back from one system to another, you may find some annoyances with how maybe you're writing formulas or some of the formatting things that are slightly different. But in general, they all work basically the same way. And what you can do with these systems is start with your bank's data or your credit card's data, right? And then export that information and then add it to a database system. That way you don't have to manually type all the information, but instead you can use the data as a starting point, get it in a system that works for you, that you might have a little bit more control manipulating. And then you can add categories to the data and then also a business purpose. This gives you a little bit more control and a little bit more sort of ownership of manipulating the data. You're not limited to what's already built into your bank system, especially if you kind of invest in some Excel skills or you're feeling pretty savvy. There are a whole lot of really interesting things you can do with these programs that enable you to create charts and graphs and identify different metrics and also create different planning scenarios. So what would you do if that project came through? Or what would you do if you decided to take a residency later this fall, right? So you can sort of use some what we would call what if analysis in budgeting world to change different assumptions using your numbers and your projections, and then kind of use it as a planning tool, which is pretty cool. If this is something that's interesting to you, this is how you might set up that Google Sheet or Excel document or numbers file. You'll see I've got it organized in columns. That's the default setting. And then we've got all the key information captured: the date of the transaction, the vendor or the client or the counterparty, the amount, and the category. I've also left a lot of room here for the business purpose. And I would say, as you export the information from your bank account or your credit card statement, pay attention to the default setting for the columns, right? So if amount is the first column, followed by vendor and then date, make your columns match what the export is, because that will save you time and headaches down the road. So if this is something that's interesting to you, I would say poke around on your bank's website or your credit card's website and see if you can find a way to export the data as a CSV file. Then open it up in a Google Sheet or in an Excel spreadsheet and start playing around and formatting the information. This process is going to be easier if you have a separate credit card or a separate bank account for your business transactions. Because if that's the case, all you have to do is export everything that's there and you're finished. If you have one account that covers both personal and business expenses, you may need to do a little bit more cleanup on the data to make sure you're separating out what is personal and what is business. So keep that in mind as well in terms of how you might want to use your time. The last option is if you don't want to do either of those things. You don't want to use what your bank already offers. You don't want to use or build your own database system. You just want to use an existing system that someone else has created. And in that case, you're probably looking at a software system, most of which have migrated to subscription-based platforms now. And if you're thinking about a personal finance tracking system, two of my favorites are YNAB, which stands for You Need a Budget, and Personal Capital, both of which grab data from your bank account and credit cards and retirement accounts and sort of pull it all together in one place, which is really nice. Or for business purposes, you might be looking at a system like QuickBooks, or FreshBooks is really popular, especially for invoicing options, or Wave or Xero, which are newer entrants to the market, but are both wonderful platforms that creative individuals really swear by, especially Wave, which has been getting a lot of great attention lately. These are what some of those systems might look like. Here are the personal ones, right? The focus is on personal spending and wealth accumulation. And again, these different options give you lots of different information, lots of charts, lots of graphs, lots of insights into where your money is going, and maybe some proactive options for thinking about where you want your money to go. In terms of business systems, there are also similar dashboards that focus on income generally from customers. These are the systems that will very often integrate with MailChimp or Constant Contact, which is a useful feature, right? And also opportunities here to think about what your spending has been in what categories, and maybe even, again, doing some proactive planning. So your action item is to kind of figure out what you're really looking for. Are you looking for one that is more personal in nature? Or are you looking for one that's more business in nature? Or are you looking for both? If you were using, say, YNAB or Mint, or a system that was designed to be personal in nature, you can certainly add some additional categories that are specific to your business and capture all the information in one place. But that might make it a little bit harder at tax time to kind of pull out only the business related stuff. Either way is perfectly fine. You get to decide what your tracking priority might be. If we were thinking about pros and cons of these different options, I might say that the automatic transfer of the information by using your bank's website or any of the software systems is a really big benefit, right? By linking your financial information with these software platforms, yes, there is a potential security risk, right? But there is definitely a benefit in that the information goes through automatically and you do not necessarily have to manually enter it or export that CSV file or do any formatting, which could be a really good benefit. All of these systems do enable you to sort expenses by category. I would say if it's being done automatically through a software system or through your bank's website, though, you need to do some babysitting of the sorting to make sure it's accurate, right? These AI systems learn and improve over time, but even after using them for extended periods of time, I still spot inconsistencies in how categories are applied. So this will probably never be something that you can ignore completely. When it comes to you're using your own database system, you have a lot more control there. So you are spending more time and not relying on AI, but you also know it's accurate. In terms of automatic reporting, these vary. The business software systems typically have really fantastic automatic reporting tools. Almost every business software platform will have, a P&L or a profit and loss statement that would show your income and expenses. It will also have a balance sheet, and it may also offer different customer detail. So you can see profitability by customer or how long it takes certain customers to pay their invoices, all of which is really interesting information for you to have access to. That's also really important if you are applying for any of the emergency grants or funds or any of the pandemic related assistance. If you had quick access to a profit and loss statement for your business, that made the application process so much easier. And if you were thinking about the second round of PPP, if you were able to very quickly run a profit and loss statement by quarter for the year 2019 and the year 2020, it was even easier to identify which quarter may have satisfied the requirement to make you eligible for the second round of PPP funding. And of course, integration with customers is one that pretty much you're going to be looking at a business system if this is an option that's really important to you. There's a question in the chat about something that's tailored for startups, which is a really great question. And I would say all of these can be used for startups. It really just kind of depends on how much you're willing and able to invest at the very beginning of your business process. A system like Wave or a system like QuickBooks, especially QuickBooks for self-employed individuals or small businesses, all come at more accessible price points than some of the more robust options. But something like QuickBooks might have more features than you really need as a startup. So you might say, as a startup, I am very happy using the information from my bank because that means I don't have to pay for anything. And I will separately track my customers, maybe in a spreadsheet, maybe in some email data, or maybe even in the free version of MailChimp, for example. And then as the company grows or as it becomes more reasonable to spend $20 or $30 on a sort of financial tracking system each month, then maybe you migrate to one of those systems down the road. But they can all be adapted for early stage businesses. It's really just a matter of how much time and energy you want to spend getting all that set up at the very beginning. So how do you go about choosing? I like thinking about this from a really sort of almost tailored checklist of different questions to think about. So the idea of what do you want from a system is huge. Are you looking for a personal system, a business system, or both? If you are running a nonprofit organization, you don't get to answer this question because you are looking for a system that is only serving your nonprofit organization, and we're not commingling any other information. But if you are an individual artist who's running a business and maybe having additional sources of personal income, you might want some sort of system that covers both personal and professional expenses. or you might want to keep them completely separate. Either way is fine, but get clear with yourself on what you're looking for. It's also important to understand if you need this system to invoice customers. If you regularly invoice customers, maybe you are a musician and you teach students regularly and you send invoices, say, once a month, or maybe you're a graphic designer and you send project bids to clients, require a 50% deposit, and then invoice them at the end of the project. If that feels like part of your creative and professional process, then you will probably need some sort of system that enables you to send invoices to customers and then accept either bank transfers or credit card payments through that system. So you're probably looking at a business software subscription program to enable you to do that. Or maybe you think about incorporating Stripe perhaps to your website, or some people even will use PayPal or Venmo for something like that, which again can satisfy the invoicing need, but it kind of misses out on some of the other benefits of categorizing expenses and income and tracking customers and things like that. Do you need it to talk to other systems? What level of integration are you looking for? And again, this might change as your business changes over time or as your needs change over time. If it's really important to you to not spend time updating multiple systems every time a new potential customer sends an inquiry through your website, then you probably want a system that's pretty well integrated between your customer relation management tool, whatever that might look like, and your financial tool. And then we also want to think about how many transactions you have, right? Some of these subscription platforms are not free. Often there is a free version of them, or sometimes a free trial version for, say, a 6-month period. But if you're looking at maybe having 2 or 3 transactions every month and not necessarily needing to invoice customers with any regularity, it may not make sense for you to think about subscribing to a business system yet. In that case, maybe what is provided by your financial institution or what you can build in your own database system will work for you. And then lastly, how do you like to work? Is this something that you sort of take joy in building a database system or using Excel? Or does that make your skin crawl and make you want to do anything that is not related to Excel? We also want to think about the cost, both in dollar terms and in time terms. And I will remind you that if you are not paying for something, then you are probably the product. So if you are going to use a platform like Mint or another option with a free version of the software, make sure you clearly understand how the data is being collected and then possibly used or sold. There's a lot of great information you can get around this and some watchdog groups that will keep an eye on this, but that's definitely something you want to be clear about before you start providing access to your financial information to these different platforms. And then think about whether or not the support is built in. QuickBooks does provide fantastic support, but usually there's an additional fee for that. So if you are looking for some handholding with the software program or someone to go to for support, and you want that to be included in the cost, make sure you're aware of what you are really paying for. Almost all these systems have historical tracking, meaning they can look backwards and report information about what was spent or what was earned. Some of them also have prospective tools, which you can use for budgeting or looking forward. And you may also think about incorporating different goal setting tools into this as well. You want to understand how it's going to communicate with you. If you want automatic reports that are sent to you regularly, that would be fantastic. And most of the software platforms and even your bank systems can do that. If you only want to access this information from a mobile device, make sure you're comfortable with how the app works and the fact that it will meet your needs. And be clear about whether the reports exist and will automatically be sent to you, or if you have to navigate to them and manually run them. Again, either way is fine, but we want this system to make your life easier, not harder. And of course, there's a lot of security questions that you should be thinking about as part of this. Is the data safe? Is it secure? Are you comfortable with importing information from your financial institution and the potential risks that might carry? Who else might have access to this and what does that look like? And Will you still have access to the information if you leave the system? So let's say you have a startup, you are just getting started, and you are using the bank's existing system to track all of your income and expenses. If you decide down the road to switch to, say, Wave, is there a way to get that data out of the bank system and then import it into Wave? Or do you have to fully stop using the old system and start using the new one? It's an interesting question to ask, especially if you think you might be living with a system for a shorter period of time and then updating it later. And then this one gets overlooked, but do you actually know anyone who's using this system? And the reason I think this is interesting is because lots of systems provide support, right? And forums and frequently asked questions and sometimes tech support on call, all of which is great. But if the person in the studio next to you is using the same system, that might be an even better opportunity to pop in and say, hey, how do you add a new customer or something like that, right? So really lean into your network and understand what systems are being used by others. And if you want a more tangible form of that community support for your system, that could be something to consider. And then, of course, you can also check general reviews, how many active users there are, what issues do people complain about, and is that something that would really bother you long term? And then, is it actually going to help you? Almost all of these different systems, with the exception of Excel, if you are building it for yourself, offer articles and tutorials and community support and, email nudges for taking different actions, right? So if that's something that would be helpful for you, that's probably something to think about. And if you are looking for Excel tutorials, YouTube is full of them. And there's also a website called mrexcel.com that has some really fantastic resources about learning how to use different formulas effectively. And then, of course, there is a big blank category about what else you're curious about. If you love your particular CRM and you want to make sure that whatever you're using engages with that, that's probably something you want to know. If you use a scheduling tool like a Calendly or a Time Trade or something like that, and you want to incorporate invoicing into that, make sure the invoicing system supports that, right? So there's room for you to also reflect on what you need the system to do. Once you know what you need it to do and what you're keeping and how you're managing it, we need to know how long you have to keep all this information. For tax purposes, the IRS says you must retain records for the statute of limitations. That is the time that the IRS has to examine your tax return and ask questions. The general statute of limitations is 3 years, starting on the later of when your tax return is due or when it is actually filed. So in this example, if you had an expense on January 5th of 2021 and you filed your tax return on April 12th of 2022, claiming this as a deduction on your tax return, your statute of limitations would start on April 15th of 2022. So 3 days after you file it, and then it continues for 3 full years. That's the normal statute of limitations. However, if you have what's called a gross misstatement, so an error of plus or minus 10% on your tax return, the 3-year statute can be extended to 6 years, which is why the conventional wisdom is to save everything for 7 years. That is the 6-year extended statute of limitations plus the initial year when the expense actually happened. So that's how we get to the general rule of thumb that says keep everything for 7 years, but you're welcome to keep it for longer as well. In terms of tips for best practices, I generally suggest having a separate bank account just for your business. If you have an LLC, you must do this for liability protection purposes. And of course, if you are running a not-for-profit organization or if you have fiscal sponsorship, then we absolutely want to keep that separate as well. But if you are an individual operating as a sole proprietor, you can do everything under one bank account, but it will probably make your life a little bit easier if you separate things out. That's what I would generally suggest. And I would also generally suggest that you carve out about 2 hours each month to update your books and records, right? To update your income, to update your expenses, to categorize things, to look at your calendar and make sure you have tracked your mileage, to do anything else related to tracking that you need to do on a monthly basis. And if you wanted to kind of expand this a little bit, you could think about looking and checking in with any outstanding invoices and sending reminders to clients. Or you could even use this time to maybe engage in a bit of marketing, right? Reaching out to potential partners or supporters you might have, right? Thinking about setting aside 2 hours each month for the money part, and then maybe adding another hour or so for some intentional outreach and engagement. That may enable you to just find the rhythm that works for you for this information so that it doesn't add up at the end of the year. And so that you can be taking advantage of some of those proactive reasons for keeping records, like having a better sense of intentionality around where money is coming from and where it's going. So my suggestion for what you should do now would be to do your own research into some of these systems, maybe even choosing 3 that might work best for you, and then go deep into some of those questions, right? Because they all have different options. I will say FreshBooks tends to be a preferred alternative to QuickBooks for many creative individuals. The layout is a little cleaner. It's a little bit more simple to use, and it has really powerful invoicing systems. So a lot of graphic designers, for example, who regularly invoice clients, do it through FreshBooks and love it. I am a QuickBooks user, so I've gotten really comfortable with the functionality there, and I love all the things you can do with QuickBooks, but it might be more than what you need, especially if you're looking at paying $26 a month for a subscription or so, and that might not necessarily make sense in your budget right now. Sage is another great accounting platform. Zoho, Wave, and Xero we've all mentioned. Quicken is sort of QuickBooks for personal purposes, right? So some people really like that as an alternative. And then, of course, we know all about Mint and YNAB. And then Future Advisor and Personal Capital are other more recent personal finance software tracking systems that have come on the market. Envelopes is kind of a fun one too. It builds on the old envelope style of budgeting that you may have heard about maybe about in the 90s or so. This is when if you found yourself maybe spending a little bit too much, the advice was generally to go to kind of an all cash approach where you would take the money you were going to spend and put it in different physical envelopes that you might keep, say, in a kitchen or something like that. And each one would be labeled. So one for food, one for clothing, one for utilities. Envelopes, the software platform, is sort of a more updated digital version of that. And it has visual representations of money moving. I've also shared 2 articles here that review a number of different systems through various perspectives, so you might find those helpful as well. And when you get a copy of this slide deck, you are welcome to dig into those and use them to jump off into your research. I will pause here to see if we have additional questions.
Well, I want to thank you for going through this because it kind of helps be brave and stuff like that. And I have to say is that's, so if I recently started a nonprofit and kind of an LLC to handle the things that were not appropriate to put on a startup nonprofit, right? So, and so we have the same bank has this both accounts. And yeah, and so, and I just use the debit card, right? And the bank does have the annotations and stuff like that to be able to add that information in the account as we go. So, and what was really kind of fun too is that we used Square over the last year. Because to help out the farmers market, and so I got an experience with that.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and that was it. And one thing that was really great about that is that they offered kind of like they offer services along the way. right, to do kind of summaries and reports for you, like you said.
Mhm.
And they're kind of like, "Oh, have you thought about this?" And then, here's like the end of the year report for you. And they say, this might not be right, but here's a good first cut at it. So I really appreciated
Oh
that.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and Square is another great option, right? And it works really well to accept payments sort of live and in person because they have the credit card readers, but then also kind of the back end reporting is really powerful as well. And as the business grows, right? Generally not for sort of very early stages, but as the business grows, often you will use your credit card on a Square reader, right? And then the company will then have your email address. You can usually opt out of joining their newsletter at the point of transaction, right? But there,
Yeah.
again, there are all these integration opportunities that might make sense down the road.
Well, having a service, I think at the end of the day, the thing that we would really prefer is having something that could very quickly print out kind of like a tailored receipt.
Mm,
That makes sense?
it
And
does.
and we'd like to actually have fun with the receipt, because we think it adds to the experience. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It adds to the experience at the farmer's market, and we're going to bring the children's museum to the farmer's market. And so we'd like to have fun with the receipt because we think it's really fun for the little kids to get this little receipt at the end. Does that make sense?
Oh,
So
it
those
does.
are some thoughts.
Oh my
So
gosh, that's super, super cool. I have two thoughts, and I will say, I mean, not all of my ideas are good ones, so ignore whatever doesn't make sense.
Okay.
But there's a museum called the Color Factory in New York,
Oh,
and they have a location in Houston as well, and they do pop-ups in other areas.
okay.
And one of the really cool things they did is they shared a special like pin code. And then you could go to, I think it was a Chase ATM, like around the corner from the Color Factory, and you enter that code, and then the ATM spits out something from the Color Factory that was like, thanks for visiting, here's your color, or something like that, right? And
Yeah.
so I have no idea how the technology works, right? But I have to believe that some digging might give you some interesting jumping off points to maybe replicate something like that.
Well,
And
it'd
then,
be fun to even ask them, how they put that together. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, and I have to say is that the Association of Children's Museums, they think a lot about this type of stuff. And, and they think it's also a fun way of doing stuff like that to get kids interested in, and paying attention to these things that, what is my parent even doing? I don't know.
Right. Oh, you're so right. Well, and children especially have such a tactile approach to the world, right? Getting that receipt is a powerful moment, right? So I could even see, and
Well, then
I'm thinking,
beginners too.
especially, yeah, I'm thinking especially with the Square reader. I know I've seen some, maybe the iPad version instead of the plug into the phone version that does have a receipt printing capability. So that's probably something to dig into, and sort of asking the question about, can you customize the receipts, right? Is there an option to, rotate logos at the bottom, or add different illustrations, or, images of different vegetables from the farmer's market for a scavenger hunt kind of thing, right? Like you could do so many sort of really
Oh,
creative things with that.
I like that a lot. That's a very fun
Yeah,
idea.
yeah. But those would be the two places I would start. Color Factory to kind of see what they did technology wise, to see if you can pirate / borrow it. And then also figuring out with the Square reader, since it's what you already have, if, upgrading to the iPad version might give you that printability that you're kind of seeking.
Very fantastic. It looks like you got a question from Louise too.
Oh, nice. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for keeping an eye on that for me. The question in the chat, in my experience, what system has been the best to track customer information and go back to edit their information or add notes? Personally, MailChimp and Constant Contact are the two that get the most positive reviews. Both of those allow for segmentation of your customers and also gather data like how often they're opening your communications, where they're clicking on different things, right? So if you know that you have, say 10% of your mailing list that always opens your emails, you can go through each person and see, okay, where do they click within the email? And maybe you notice that your most dedicated people are always interested in this third point of your email newsletter or something, right? So that gets a lot of really good information. And both of those systems also allow you to have a notes field in them, right? So if you wanted to say, you know, person I met at the art festival, or, you know, person I met at this particular opening or this performance, you can manually add those notes to both systems and they will be stored forever, and you can regularly update them. If your nonprofit is growing, and depending on what you're doing, or if your creative business is growing and you are needing more sort of donor tracking software, you can certainly look at different ticketing platforms that have opportunities to track different donors. And each one has various opportunities for how much data you can collect. You would want to maybe think about purchasing something like a maybe Donor Perfect or Ovation or something like that, instead of only using maybe Eventbrite, just because of the access to the information. Or if you are going to use Eventbrite or Zoom or anything else, maybe then you get the data out of that one-time ticketing platform and move it into the system that you are using. Again, maybe it's Constant Contact or MailChimp or anything else. But both of those, and generally most of the systems will allow you to add notes over time. And that's a really handy thing to do. Razor's Edge tends to be sort of the big deal in donor tracking software, but that is often more robust and more expensive than someone would need. So, you know, usually most organizations don't start there, but they might grow there and get there over time. And yes, it was Constant Contact and MailChimp were those two kind of email communication platforms that tend to be the entry point for tracking your customers. And they have integration opportunities with most of the major financial systems as well. What other questions might we have?
Do you have any experience with, oh, here, should let Eric go, but I was also thinking about Behance, because I think some systems like that are very artist interested is that they're using something called Portfolio to put websites online, and those websites can actually be tweaked to be for with pay services. Does that make sense? Stores. So, but let Eric ask a question. Sorry.
Yeah. I'll just follow up, Amy, really fast. You are absolutely right. As some of them are stingier with the information, especially about sort of who's purchasing and who's clicking. But often you can layer in or enable Google Analytics even on your Behance page. And then you can at least get some information about how people are finding you and how long they're staying on your site and things like that. Arrow, what's on your mind?
Analytics. So as somebody who waffles back and forth between embracing technology and being like, this is great, and then being like, no, I still want to write everything on paper. You provided a lot of really great tools and oversights. But if for people who are maybe a little more old fashioned and do want to do things really with pen and paper, do you have suggestions about methods for that? Even, you can always, of course, buy tools for pen and paper. Like you can buy notebooks, right, that are more accounting based, or I'd just be interested in what like pen and paper methods you might encourage people to take a look at.
Yeah. Oh, what a wonderful question. I haven't gotten to talk about ledger paper in years. But sort of that would be kind of the traditional pen and paper approach. And what it would kind of look like in practice is purchasing, we call it ledger paper. It kind of looks like a grid, and you can usually buy it at any office supply store, or it could just be regular lined notebook paper, or even a tangible notebook. And the way we would typically use it is label a category at the top of each sheet. So maybe as you're thinking about your creative practice, practice, maybe your business categories are rent and utilities and subscriptions and supplies, right? You might have 4 pages with a different category at the top. And then every time you might start gathering your receipts, daily or monthly or whatever kind of rhythm works for you. And then you would go through the receipts and maybe then also look through your credit card statement or your bank statement to see what spending you may have forgotten to get a receipt for, right? And use that and then just kind of list it out on that ledger paper, right? And you would list the same information, the date, the vendor, the amount, and then the business purpose of the transaction. Purchased new Moleskine notebooks from Barnes and Noble to draft brilliant new poetry idea or something, right? That could be the business purpose for a purchase you made at Barnes and Noble. And then on a regular basis, maybe monthly or quarterly, you add everything up and kind of have a running total at the bottom. Super, super manual. Then you would do something similar for the income side of things, right? So anytime you received a grant or maybe applied for a grant, you might list out all those grants and even have like a coded system like applied for or received or rejected. Those are 2 R's. So maybe you choose a different letter, but you could even sort of categorize different grants you're applying for on a 5th sheet that says, grants or residencies or projects or something like that. Or if you are directly serving individuals, maybe you're doing copy editing for them or commissioning certain work or something like that, you might have another sheet for that. And then at the end of the year, you would gather all that, take this summary information, probably double check your math because you're doing it by hand instead of relying on Excel or some other system to add it all up for you. And then you would use that information to prepare your tax return. This has been so fantastic. There was one more comment in the chat about a book on old school accounting would be good to have on a reference. Yes, absolutely. Most individuals I work with don't really worry about debits and credits or what we would call double entry accounting. They're more thinking about cash flow, right? But yeah, either one of those approaches can work very, very well in the arts and for all the different creative things we are doing. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap us up and take us out. It was such a pleasure spending some time with you this afternoon talking about record keeping and systems and habits that might make your life a little bit easier. Coming up next at the beginning of May is our final webinar in this 3-part series on funding in the time of COVID, specifically for the arts and looking at new opportunities for funding we might have on the horizon. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and all the best with your creative pursuits.